August 26, 1071, the highlands of eastern Anatolia near the fortress town of Manzikert. Emperor Romanos IV, Diogenes surveyed his army with confidence. Before him stretched over 60,000 men, the professional soldiers of the Byzantine tagmata, mercenaries from across Europe, and levies from the Anatolian themes. At the core of his battle line stood the Cataphracts, the empire's elite heavy cavalry, armoured from head to toe in gleaming scale armour, each man and horse encased in metal, weighing together nearly half a ton. For centuries these iron-clad horsemen had been the ultimate expression of military power, the shock troops that could shatter any enemy formation. But on this day they would face an enemy that didn't fight by the rules they understood. The Seljuk Turks under Sultan Alp Arslan had brought with them the tactics of the steppe, mobile horse archers who refused to stand and fight, who melted away before charges and returned to pepper the heavy cavalry with arrows from a distance. By nightfall the Byzantine army would be destroyed, the emperor himself captured, and the era of cataphract dominance would begin its long, terminal decline. This is the story of the most heavily armoured warriors ever to ride into battle, and how the evolution of projectile weapons, particularly the crossbow, would render their magnificent armour obsolete. It's a story about how technology shifts the balance of power, how tactical innovation defeats brute force, and how the most invincible warriors of one age become the relics of the next. The word cataphract comes from the Greek cataphractos, meaning fully armoured or closed from all sides. But the cataphract was not a Greek invention. The earliest evidence of these armoured horsemen appears in Central Asia, in the region of Khwarezm near the Aral Sea, as early as the 6th century before Christ. Ancient reliefs show warriors clad in armour, armed with lance and bow, mounted on horses that are themselves protected by metal scales. These were not the light cavalry that dominated the steppes for millennia. They were something new, something revolutionary, a fusion of the nomad's horsemanship with the settled civilization's metalworking capability. The concept spread rapidly. The Assyrians experimented with armoured cavalry. The Persians under the Achaemenid Empire deployed units of heavily armoured horsemen. But it was the Parthians who truly perfected the cataphract and demonstrated its devastating potential against one of history's most formidable military machines, the Roman legions. On a scorching day in 53 BC, near the town of Keri in what is now southeastern Turkey, Marcus Licinius Crassus led 7 Roman legions, approximately 40,000 men, into the Mesopotamian desert. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome, a member of the first triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey. He sought military glory to match his political peers. What he found instead was annihilation. The Parthian army that met him numbered perhaps 10,000 men. At its core were 1,000 cataphracts under the command of the Parthian general Serena. Each cataphract wore scale armour covering his entire body, closed helmets with only eye slits, mail coats beneath the scales, their horses similarly armoured, particularly across the front and flanks. They wielded massive lances, some accounts say up to 4 meters long, capped with iron or bronze points designed to punch through Roman shields and armour. Behind these heavy cavalry rode 9,000 horse archers, the other half of the Parthian tactical system. The Romans formed their standard defensive formation, the testudo, shields locked together to create a protective shell. The Parthian horse archers circled the Roman formation, loosing arrows from every direction. The Romans endured this, knowing their discipline and armour would protect them, until the Parthians exhausted their arrows. But Serena had brought a camel train loaded with ammunition. The arrow storm never stopped. When Roman units broke formation to charge the archers, the cataphracts struck. 1,000 armoured horsemen moving at full gallop, lances levelled, hit the scattered Roman infantry like a hammer. The impact was devastating. The long Parthian lances had reach advantage over Roman swords and pila. The armour rendered Roman weapons largely ineffective. Eyewitness accounts describe Roman soldiers stabbing at the cataphracts and having their weapons bend or break against the scale armour. The battle became a massacre. 20,000 Romans died. 10,000 were captured. Crassus himself was killed during failed negotiations. The Parthian cataphracts had destroyed a Roman army while suffering minimal casualties themselves. It was one of Rome's worst military defeats, and it announced to the ancient world that heavy cavalry, properly employed, could dominate the battlefield. The construction of cataphract armour was an engineering marvel. A full set consisted of approximately 1,300 individual scales. Each scale was a rounded plate of bronze or iron, typically 1 to 2 millimeters thick, with 2 or 4 holes drilled into the sides. Bronze wire threaded through these holes attached each scale to an undergarment of leather or animal hide. The scales overlapped like the scales of a fish, providing flexibility while maintaining protection. The pattern of overlap meant that strikes from most angles encountered multiple layers of metal. The complete suit weighed approximately 40 kilograms, 88 pounds, not including the rider's body weight or the horse armour. The horse's armour alone could add another 20 to 30 kilograms. Together, horse and rider might weigh 500 kilograms or more. This immense weight became both the cataphract's greatest strength and its fundamental weakness. The mass meant that a cataphract charge delivered tremendous kinetic energy. Formations of heavy cavalry hitting infantry lines could shatter them through sheer physical force. The armour meant that cataphracts could largely ignore the weapons of their time. Swords bounced off the scales. Arrows, unless fired from very close range or from extremely powerful bows, couldn't penetrate. Spears often bent or broke against the layered metal. But the weight also meant vulnerability. A cataphract who fell from his horse was nearly helpless. The armour was so heavy that he couldn't rise without assistance. He became a stationary target. Ancient accounts described cataphracts knocked from their mounts being clubbed to death while struggling to stand, their own armour preventing escape. The horses suffered too. Despite their armour, the sheer burden exhausted them quickly. Cataphract charges couldn't be sustained. They were single, devastating blows. If the initial impact failed to break the enemy, the cataphracts often found themselves in extended combat where their lack of mobility became fatal. Overheating was another critical problem. Inside all that metal, in the heat of battle, literally and figuratively, cataphracts could succumb to heat exhaustion. The Roman Emperor Aurelian exploited this weakness brilliantly when he fought the Palmyrene cataphracts under Queen Zenobia. Aurelian's lighter cavalry provoked the Palmyrene cataphracts into charging, then retreated without engaging. They led the heavy cavalry in circles under the Syrian sun until horses and riders were exhausted. Then Aurelian's fresh cavalry struck, annihilating the Palmyrene cataphracts who were too tired to fight effectively. Despite these limitations, cataphracts remained the elite troops of Eastern armies for centuries. The Sassanid Persians, successors to the Parthians, elevated the cataphract to near-mythical status. Sassanid cataphracts, called klibonarii, wore even heavier armour. Some descriptions suggest full-plate construction rather than scales. These warriors were the aristocratic elite of Persian society, comparable to medieval knights, but existing 1,000 years earlier. When Rome adopted cataphracts in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, they did so in direct response to crushing defeats at Parthian and Sassanid hands. Roman cataphracts never quite matched their Eastern counterparts, partly because the Roman military tradition emphasized infantry, partly because the Western provinces lacked the horse-breeding traditions of the East. But Byzantine cataphracts, the Eastern Roman continuation, became formidable. By the 6th century AD, Byzantine military manuals detailed complex cataphract tactics, coordinated charges, the use of supporting infantry, combined operations with archers. The Byzantine Empire's survival for another 500 years owed much to its heavy cavalry. But even as cataphracts reached their apex under the Byzantines, the seeds of their obsolescence were germinating far to the east. In China, sometime around the 5th century BC, an unknown inventor created a weapon that would revolutionize warfare: the crossbow. The Chinese crossbow was a sophisticated device from its inception. Unlike a bow, which requires the archer to hold the string at full draw while aiming, the crossbow used a mechanical trigger to hold the drawn string. This meant the operator could take unlimited time to aim. It meant less physical strength was required. A crossbow could be operated by someone who lacked the years of training necessary to master a traditional bow. The Chinese recognized its potential immediately. By the Warring States period, entire units of crossbowmen operated on battlefields. The Qin dynasty standardized crossbow production, creating interchangeable parts that allowed field repairs. Chinese military treatises stated explicitly that crossbows used en masse were the most effective weapon against cavalry charges. The bolts, shorter than arrows and unable to be reused easily by enemy archers, created a barrier of projectiles that could stop mounted attacks. The weapon spread westward slowly. Ancient Greeks developed the gastrophetes, a crossbow-like weapon in the 4th century BC. But for centuries, crossbows in the West remained primarily hunting tools or minor siege weapons. The Romans used some crossbow-type devices, but never in large numbers. The weapon that would truly challenge the supremacy of heavy cavalry didn't emerge in Europe until almost 1,000 years after the Chinese invention. In 947 AD, French sources mention crossbows used during the siege of Senlis. This represents the re-emergence of the crossbow in European warfare. Over the next century, the weapon spread rapidly across the continent. By the time of the First Crusade in 1096, crossbows were common enough that Anna Comnena, daughter of Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus, could describe them as a weapon of the barbarians, by which she meant Western Europeans. Anna's description is telling. She wrote that the crossbow exerted tremendous violence and force, that its missiles transfixed shields, cut through heavy iron breastplates, and resumed flight on the far side. She called it a truly diabolical machine, noting that men struck by crossbow bolts died without feeling the blow. This was hyperbole, but not by much. The medieval European crossbow was a fundamentally different weapon from earlier bows. Traditional bows, even powerful longbows, relied on the archer's strength and the bow's flexibility. Draw weights for war bows typically range from 80 to 150 pounds for the most powerful examples. Crossbows, using mechanical advantage through various spanning devices, achieved draw weights of 300, 500, even over 1,000 pounds for the most powerful models. A crossbow bolt was shorter and heavier than an arrow. Where an arrow might weigh 20 to 30 grams, a crossbow bolt could weigh up to 100 grams. The bolt head was typically a bodkin point, a narrow pyramid of hardened steel designed specifically to penetrate armor. The combination of high draw weight, heavy projectile and armor-piercing point gave late medieval crossbows penetrative power, equivalent to modern handguns. Researchers testing period crossbows have measured kinetic energy deliveries exceeding 400 joules. For comparison, many modern pistol rounds deliver between 300 and 500 joules. The crossbow's mechanical nature offered other advantages beyond raw power. The flat trajectory and short flight time of the bolt increased accuracy in siege or defensive situations. A crossbowman could remain behind cover, then rise, aim carefully, and shoot with precision. The spanning mechanism meant that crossbows could be prepared in advance and held ready indefinitely. A line of crossbowmen could maintain continuous fire by rotating shooters while others reloaded. This was impossible with traditional bows, where archers fatigued quickly from holding the draw. Most critically, the crossbow required minimal training. While a longbowman might need years of practice to achieve combat effectiveness, a crossbow could be taught in days or weeks. This democratized warfare in a way that terrified the military aristocracy. The medieval military system depended on knights, heavily armored cavalry, who represented years of training and enormous expense to equip. A knight's armor, weapons, and horse cost as much as a small village produced in a year. Knights formed the aristocratic warrior class, and their dominance on the battlefield reinforced their social and political power. Then came the crossbow, a weapon that allowed a peasant with minimal training to kill a knight from 100 meters away. The aristocracy was horrified. In 1096, Pope Urban II, the same pope who launched the First Crusade, issued a decree forbidding the use of crossbows in Christian versus Christian warfare. The Second Lateran Council in 1139 reaffirmed this ban, declaring crossbows too murderous for use except against infidels. Pope Innocent III confirmed the prohibition again at the end of the 12th century. Conrad III, Duke of Swabia and Holy Roman Emperor, banned crossbows throughout Central Europe on religious and moral grounds. England's aristocracy inserted crossbow prohibition into the Magna Carta of 1215, giving religious prohibition the colour of civil law. None of it worked. The weapon was too effective. The bans actually accelerated its spread, particularly in regions like Bohemia, which became crossbow manufacturing centres. Professional crossbowmen, particularly from Genoa and Milan, became the most sought-after mercenaries in Europe. Genoese crossbowmen fought in battles across the continent, their services purchased by anyone who could afford them. Cities formed crossbow guilds and civic militias. The weapon had become indispensable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Remember the cataphracts. Remember Manzikert. Byzantine cataphracts in 1071 weren't defeated by crossbows. They were defeated by a much older weapon, the composite bow in the hands of highly mobile horse archers. The Seljuk Turks who destroyed Romanos's army used classical steppe tactics perfected over millennia. Refuse direct engagement, shoot from a distance, wear down the enemy. When they're exhausted and disorganized, strike decisively. The Byzantine heavy cavalry at Manzikert couldn't catch the Seljuk horse archers. When they charged, the Turks simply rode away, continuing to shoot as they retreated. When the Byzantines tried to maintain formation, the arrows found gaps in their armour. When Byzantine units became separated, Seljuk cavalry surrounded and destroyed them. Emperor Romanos fought bravely, but tactics and mobility defeated armour and discipline. This pattern repeated across medieval battlefields. Heavy cavalry remained powerful when they could force close combat, but increasingly they couldn't. Infantry learned to use terrain, fortifications, and missile weapons to negate cavalry charges. Pike formations proved that disciplined foot soldiers could stop mounted knights, and crossbows gave those foot soldiers the power to kill armoured cavalry before they even made contact. The real turning point came in the 12th and 13th centuries as crossbow technology advanced dramatically. Early crossbows used composite bows made of wood, horn, and sinew. These were powerful but sensitive to weather. Rain could render them useless. By the 13th century, crossbow makers began experimenting with steel prods. The steel bow of a crossbow was called the prod, and steel prods revolutionized the weapon. Steel could achieve much higher draw weights than composite materials. Steel didn't warp in wet weather. Steel prods required more force to draw, but medieval engineers developed solutions. The simplest was the belt hook. The crossbowman would place his foot in a stirrup at the front of the crossbow, hook his belt to the string, and stand up, using his entire body weight and leg strength to draw the weapon. This allowed spanning of crossbows up to 300 pounds draw weight. For more powerful weapons, the goat's foot lever provided mechanical advantage. A hinged arm attached to the stock multiplied the user's force, allowing spanning of crossbows up to 500 pounds. The most powerful crossbows used either a cranaquin or a windlass. The cranaquin was a geared device that attached to the crossbow stock. Turning a handle rotated gears that pulled the string back. The windlass was even more powerful, essentially a small winch. Both devices could span crossbows with draw weights exceeding 1,000 pounds. These monster crossbows could penetrate any armour of their era at reasonable combat ranges. A steel bodkin point fired from a 1,000-pound crossbow could punch through plate armour at 50 metres. It could certainly penetrate the scale armour of a cataphract. But here's the historical irony. By the time European crossbows reached this level of power, cataphracts had largely disappeared from Western battlefields. The Byzantine Empire, the last major power to employ cataphracts extensively, was in terminal decline after Manzikert. The Crusader states in the Middle East did encounter some armoured cavalry, but the bulk of Muslim forces they fought were lighter cavalry, more mobile and less heavily armoured than classical cataphracts. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century brought another wave of horse archers to Eastern Europe, and medieval Europeans found crossbows effective against them. But these weren't cataphracts either. In fact, the closest thing to a direct confrontation between peak crossbow technology and cataphract-style heavy cavalry didn't involve actual cataphracts at all. It involved European knights, who by the 14th century had evolved into something very similar to the ancient heavy cavalry. Medieval knights wore full-plate armour that weighed 30 to 40 kilograms. They rode large warhorses bred for carrying heavy loads. They fought with lances in mass charges designed to break enemy formations through shock and impact. They were, functionally, the Western equivalent of cataphracts, separated by 1,000 years but following the same tactical and technological logic, and European infantry, equipped with crossbows, developed tactics specifically designed to defeat them. The most effective was the combination of crossbows and defensive terrain. Infantry would take position on hills or behind fortifications where cavalry couldn't charge effectively. Crossbowmen would shoot at the knights as they approached. If the knights charged anyway, pikemen or other polearm troops would receive the charge, while crossbowmen continued shooting from protected positions. This proved devastatingly effective. At the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, Flemish infantry armed with pikes and crossbows destroyed a French army of armoured cavalry. The cavalry charges broke against the pike wall, and crossbow bolts killed knights who survived the initial impact. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen achieved similar results, though this involved longbows rather than crossbows. The principle was the same. Projectile weapons, used by well-positioned infantry, could defeat heavy cavalry without ever allowing close combat. The aristocratic cavalry, whether called cataphracts or knights, couldn't leverage their advantages in armour and mounted shock combat if they couldn't reach their enemies. The defining characteristic of crossbow warfare was its ability to kill at range. A knight could survive sword cuts, he could ride through flights of hunting arrows. But a heavy crossbow bolt, fired from a weapon with half a ton of draw weight, carrying kinetic energy equivalent to a pistol bullet, would penetrate his armour. The historical record is filled with accounts of knights killed by crossbow fire. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, died from infection after a crossbow bolt struck him during a siege. Kings and nobles, protected by the finest armour money could buy, proved as vulnerable to crossbows as common soldiers. This vulnerability was exactly why the church and aristocracy tried so desperately to ban the weapon. They weren't concerned about its cruelty. Medieval warfare was universally cruel. They were concerned about its levelling effect. The crossbow undermined the entire basis of feudal military power. A peasant militia with crossbows could defeat knights who represented enormous investment and years of training. This was socially revolutionary. It meant that cities, guilds, and commoners could defend themselves against aristocratic cavalry. It meant that military power no longer correlated directly with social status and wealth. The same dynamic had existed with cataphracts in earlier eras, though it played out differently. Cataphracts were expensive. Maintaining a force of heavy cavalry required a wealthy state or wealthy individuals. The Sassanid Persian cataphracts were aristocrats. Byzantine cataphracts came from the military elite. This limited their numbers. Armies might field hundreds or at most a few thousand cataphracts. The bulk of forces consisted of lighter cavalry or infantry. When cataphracts succeeded, as at Caeri, it was through tactical brilliance combined with the unique capabilities of the heavy cavalry. When they failed, as at Manzikert, it was often because they were too few, too slow, or because the enemy refused to fight on terms that favoured them. Crossbows followed a different trajectory. As technology improved and production scaled up, crossbows became cheaper and more available. What began as a specialised weapon for mercenaries evolved into standard equipment for city militias. By the 15th century, thousands of crossbowmen could be fielded in a single battle. The weapon had democratized. The comparison is instructive. Cataphracts represented the concentration of military power in a small elite. Heavy armour, expensive horses, years of training. Only the wealthy could afford to equip cataphracts. Only established cavalry traditions could train them effectively. They were inherently limited in number, inherently exclusive. Crossbows represented the distribution of military power to the masses, cheap to produce compared to armour and war horses, easy to learn compared to traditional archery, effective in the hands of part-time soldiers. They were inherently scalable, inherently democratic. This pattern appears repeatedly in military history. Technologies that concentrate power in elites eventually lose to technologies that distribute power more widely. The cataphract dominated for centuries because infantry had no effective counter to heavy cavalry charges. Once infantry gained weapons that could kill armoured cavalry at range, the balance shifted permanently. But we shouldn't romanticize this shift as some kind of democratic revolution. Crossbow-armed, infantry still died in vast numbers. Medieval warfare remained brutal, chaotic, and dominated by elements beyond individual weapon choice, and crossbows had significant limitations that prevented them from immediately ending cavalry dominance. The most critical limitation was rate of fire. An experienced longbowman could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute. A crossbowman, even with simple spanning mechanisms, could manage perhaps 2 bolts per minute. With mechanical spanning devices like the Cranaquin or windlass, the rate dropped to 1 bolt per minute or less. This meant crossbowmen were extremely vulnerable during reloading. They needed support from other troops, particularly pikemen or shield-bearers. The pavilleur, a large shield that could be planted in the ground, became standard equipment for crossbowmen. They would shoot from behind the pavies, then take cover while reloading. Crossbows were also slower to bring into action than bows. An archer could shoot as soon as he saw a target. A crossbowman had to span his weapon first. In ambush situations or sudden encounters, this delay could be fatal. Weather affected crossbows less than traditional bows, but it still mattered. Extremely cold weather could make steel prods brittle. Heat could affect the mechanical components. Most significantly, moisture could affect the strings. While better than traditional bowstrings, crossbowstrings still lost performance when wet. Maintenance was another issue. Crossbows, with their mechanical triggers and spanning devices, required more care than simple bows. Parts could break, triggers could malfunction. For armies campaigning over long distances, this created logistical challenges. Despite these limitations, crossbows became the dominant infantry projectile weapon across most of medieval Europe by the 13th century. England remained the exception, preferring longbows for reasons related to military tradition and recruitment systems. But everywhere else, crossbows ruled. They were the weapon that made infantry dangerous to cavalry. They were the weapon that allowed cities to defend themselves. They were the weapon that broke the monopoly of armoured aristocrats on military effectiveness. And yet, the ultimate fate of both cataphracts and crossbows illustrates another pattern in military history. No weapon remains dominant forever. New technologies always emerge to change the balance again. By the late 15th century, firearms began to appear on European battlefields. Early handguns were crude, inaccurate, and slow to reload. They were actually inferior to crossbows in many ways, but they had two critical advantages. First, they produced a tremendous noise and smoke. The psychological impact was enormous. Second, they required even less training than crossbows. A man could be taught to use an arquebus in days, and firearms had one more advantage that became clear over time. They could continue to improve. Crossbow technology had more or less plateaued by the 14th century. There were limits to how much power you could extract from a steel prod without making the weapon too heavy or complex to use effectively. Firearms had no such limits. As gunpowder improved, as metallurgy advanced, as manufacturing techniques developed, firearms became more powerful, more accurate, more reliable. By the 16th century, arquebuses matched crossbows in range and exceeded them in penetrative power. By the 17th century, muskets had made crossbows obsolete for military purposes. The cataphract had disappeared centuries earlier. The last cataphracts in the traditional sense were the Byzantine heavy cavalry, destroyed in the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Heavy cavalry continued, of course. The famous heavy cavalry of the European Renaissance and early modern period, the cuirassiers and similar units, carried on the tradition. But they were fewer, lighter, and operated differently. The age of the fully armoured horse and rider as a battlefield-dominant force was over. What killed the cataphract? Not the crossbow, despite what an overly simplistic reading of history might suggest. Cataphracts declined for multiple reasons. Tactical evolution by their opponents played a role. Infantry learned to use terrain and formation to negate cavalry charges. Missile troops, whether horse archers or crossbowmen, learned to exploit the cataphract's poor mobility. Economic factors mattered. Cataphracts were incredibly expensive. As empires declined, as economies weakened, the ability to field and maintain heavy cavalry diminished. The Byzantine Empire after Manzikert never recovered its former economic strength. The cost of equipping cataphracts became prohibitive. Political changes contributed. The social structures that produced cataphracts, warrior aristocracies with hereditary cavalry traditions, broke down. In the Byzantine Empire, civil wars and political instability disrupted military recruitment and training. In the Islamic world, the rise of Mamluk and Turkish military elites who favoured different fighting styles changed army composition. Cultural factors played a role. Heavy cavalry required specific cavalry traditions, horse breeding programs, metalworking industries and training systems. As these cultural elements weakened or disappeared, so did the ability to produce effective cataphracts. But technology was certainly part of the equation. As projectile weapons improved, the survivability of heavy cavalry decreased. This made the enormous investment required for cataphracts increasingly difficult to justify. Why spend a fortune equipping a cataphract who might be killed by a bolt from a crossbow wielded by a peasant who learned to shoot last week? The cost-benefit analysis shifted. Lighter cavalry, more numerous and more mobile, became more practical. Infantry, properly equipped and trained, could defeat heavy cavalry at much lower cost. The crossbow's role in this transformation was significant, but not exclusive. Crossbows were one part of a larger evolution in warfare that saw infantry regain effectiveness against cavalry. That evolution included better armour for infantry, better weapons like pikes and halberds, better tactics using terrain and fortifications, and yes, better projectile weapons, including crossbows. The relationship between armor and projectile weapons has always been an arms race. Better armor provokes development of weapons that can penetrate it. Those weapons drive development of even better armor. The cycle continues until one side finds a breakthrough that the other can't counter. For cataphracts, the breakthroughs came on multiple fronts. Tactical innovations made their charges less effective, economic changes made them less affordable, and weapons, including the crossbow, made them less survivable. The combination proved fatal. But let's not conclude this as a story of simple technological determinism, where better weapons always win and old technologies always lose. Military history is far messier than that. Cataphracts continued to be effective in certain contexts, even after crossbows appeared. Late Byzantine and early Ottoman heavy cavalry achieved victories in the 14th and 15th centuries. Heavily armoured cavalry in Western Europe remained formidable through the 16th century. Context matters. Terrain matters. Training matters. Logistics matter. The specific circumstances of each battle matter. What's true is that the balance had shifted. The window in which cataphract-style heavy cavalry held overwhelming advantage had closed. They went from being nearly invincible to being situationally effective. That transition was gradual, taking centuries to fully play out. And during that transition, weapons like the crossbow played a crucial role. They gave infantry and defensive forces tools that could threaten even the most heavily armoured cavalry. They made heavy cavalry vulnerable in ways they hadn't been before. Perhaps the deeper lesson is about adaptation. Military systems that can't adapt to changing technology and tactics don't survive. The cataphract was a brilliant solution to the military problems of the ancient and early medieval world. Heavy armour and mounted shock combat dominated battlefields for centuries. But as the problems changed, as opponents developed counters, as technology evolved, the cataphract solution became less effective. Armies that continued investing in traditional cataphract forces found themselves defeated by opponents using newer weapons and tactics. The crossbow story illustrates the other side of adaptation. Here was a weapon that existed in crude form for over 1,000 years before really flowering in medieval Europe. Why? Because the military, economic and social conditions finally aligned to make it useful. Urban militias needed weapons that could be learned quickly. States needed weapons that could be mass-produced. Infantry needed weapons that could threaten armoured cavalry. The crossbow met all these needs simultaneously. Standing today, we can look back at both cataphracts and crossbows as historical curiosities. The cataphract survives in museums and historical reenactments, a reminder of an age when a man and horse could wear 80 kilograms of armour and charge into battle expecting to survive. The crossbow survived longer, transitioning from military weapon to hunting tool, and even today sees use in sport and hunting. Some military forces have experimented with modern tactical crossbows for special operations, where silence matters more than rate of fire, but both, in their military heyday, represented peak technologies of their eras. The cataphract was the ultimate expression of cavalry power, the heaviest armour, the strongest horses, the most devastating charges. The crossbow was the ultimate expression of mechanical projectile technology, the most powerful hand weapon until firearms, the great equalizer that let common soldiers kill knights. That they rarely, if ever, actually faced each other in decisive battle is almost beside the point. They represent two philosophical approaches to warfare, two different answers to the fundamental military question of how to kill your enemy before he kills you. The cataphract's answer was, get close, use mass and armour to survive the approach, then leverage superior equipment and training to dominate close combat. The crossbow's answer was stay distant, use projectile power to kill before the enemy reaches you, rely on simplicity and numbers rather than elite skill. Both answers worked for a time. Both eventually failed, as all military systems eventually do. New technologies, new tactics, new strategic realities render old solutions obsolete. The cycle continues today. Modern armoured vehicles are the descendants of the cataphract philosophy, using armour and mobility to dominate battlefields. Anti-tank missiles are the descendants of the crossbow philosophy, using projectile weapons to defeat armour at range. The technological sophistication has increased beyond anything ancient or medieval warriors could imagine, but the fundamental dynamic remains: protection versus penetration, elite forces versus mass armies, expensive complex systems versus cheap simple ones. These tensions don't resolve, they just shift to new equilibriums as technology and tactics evolve. The cataphract and the crossbow are long gone from actual battlefields, but the questions they represented, the problems they tried to solve, those remain with us still. How much should you invest in protecting your soldiers versus investing in weapons that can kill the enemy? When does complexity become a liability? When does simplicity become inadequate? How do you balance quality and quantity? At what point does the cost of the best individual equipment exceed its benefits? These are the questions military planners have grappled with for millennia. The cataphract and crossbow are just 2 chapters in that longer story. But they're instructive chapters. They show us how technology enables new tactics, how tactical innovations can render even the most impressive equipment obsolete, how warfare evolves not through simple linear progression, but through complex interactions of technology, economics, culture, and chance. The next time you see a museum display of cataphract armor or a replica medieval crossbow, remember you're looking at more than historical artifacts. You're looking at arguments made in metal and wood about the best way to wage war. For their time, both arguments were persuasive. The fact that neither argument remains persuasive today doesn't diminish their historical significance. It just reminds us that in warfare, as in so much else, all solutions are temporary, all advantages are fleeting. And adaptation is the only permanent requirement. The Roman Empire learned this lesson about adaptation when it first encountered cataphracts and initially failed to develop adequate responses. After Cari, Rome's legions remained fundamentally infantry-based for another 2 centuries. They made modifications, adding more cavalry, experimenting with different formations, but the core structure remained unchanged. This conservatism cost them dearly in repeated conflicts with Parthian and later Sassanid forces. Roman commanders who tried to fight Eastern heavy cavalry using traditional legion tactics found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought. It wasn't until the 3rd century crisis, when the empire faced simultaneous threats from multiple directions and traditional military structures collapsed under the strain, that Rome truly began adapting. The Roman adoption of cataphracts came piecemeal and reluctantly. Marcus Aurelius experimented with heavy cavalry units in the late 2nd century, recruiting them from allied peoples who already had cavalry traditions. Septimius Severus expanded these forces after witnessing their effectiveness during his campaigns in the East. By the time of Diocletian and Constantine in the early 4th century, heavy cavalry had become a permanent, significant component of Roman armies. But Roman cataphracts never quite achieved the same dominance as their Eastern counterparts. The cultural barriers were too strong. Rome's military identity was bound up with the legion, with disciplined infantry fighting in close formation. Heavy cavalry remained somewhat foreign, somewhat suspect, relegated to auxiliary status even when they proved their worth in battle. This cultural resistance to military innovation appears repeatedly in history. Institutions develop identities around particular ways of fighting. Those identities become self-reinforcing. Success with one method breeds commitment to that method, which creates resistance to alternatives even when circumstances change. The Byzantines, as the Eastern continuation of Rome, had less of this cultural baggage. Their military tradition was more flexible, more willing to adopt whatever worked. Byzantine military manuals like the Strategikon written under Maurice in the late 6th century show sophisticated understanding of different cavalry types and how to employ them. The Byzantines developed combined arms tactics that integrated cataphracts with lighter cavalry, infantry and archers into coordinated battle plans. They studied their enemies systematically, analysing Persian, Avar, Arab and Turkish fighting methods, then developing counters. This adaptability kept the Byzantine Empire alive for 800 years after the Western Roman Empire collapsed. But even the Byzantines couldn't adapt forever. By the 11th century, internal political decay had weakened the military system. The theme system, which had provided reliable recruitment of soldiers from landowning peasants, was breaking down as aristocratic estates absorbed peasant lands. Military spending decreased as emperors faced fiscal pressures. The tagmata, the professional corps of the Byzantine army, shrank in size and quality. When Romanos Thorf marched to Manzikert in 1071, his army was already compromised. He commanded nominal numbers, 60,000 men on paper, but significant portions were unreliable. Norman mercenaries who had been fighting for the Byzantines just years earlier now fought for whoever paid them. Armenian and Georgian levies had questionable loyalty given Byzantine political mishandling of those regions. The Turkish mercenaries in Byzantine service were of dubious reliability when fighting their ethnic cousins. Most critically, the core Byzantine heavy cavalry was smaller and less well equipped than in earlier centuries. The battle itself unfolded as a tactical disaster compounded by political treachery. Romanos deployed his army in the traditional Byzantine formation, heavy cavalry in the centre, lighter troops on the wings, infantry reserve in the rear. He advanced toward the Seljuk positions expecting a conventional battle. Alp Arslan's Seljuks instead employed what later came to be called the feigned retreat, a tactic perfected by steppe peoples over millennia. They skirmished with the Byzantine advance shooting arrows, then fell back. The Byzantine right wing pursued too eagerly, becoming separated from the main body. Seljuk cavalry wheeled around and surrounded the separated units, destroying them. The Byzantine left wing, commanded by Andronikos Doukas, either through incompetence or deliberate betrayal, withdrew from the field entirely without engaging. By late afternoon, Romanos and the centre of his army were alone, surrounded by Seljuk forces attacking from all directions. The Byzantine cataphracts fought desperately. Contemporary accounts describe their charges breaking through Seljuk encirclements multiple times. But each time they charged, the Seljuks simply opened their formations, let the heavy cavalry pass through, then closed in behind them. The Byzantines couldn't maintain formation while surrounded. Units became isolated. Horses were shot out from under riders. Men fell and couldn't rise in their heavy armour. As darkness fell, organised resistance collapsed. Romanos himself fought in the front lines until his horse was killed. Unhorsed, unable to move effectively in his armour, the emperor was captured. The Byzantine army ceased to exist as a fighting force. The immediate military consequences were severe but not immediately catastrophic. Alp Arslan, showing remarkable political acumen, treated Romanos well and released him after negotiating a peace treaty. But the political consequences inside the Byzantine Empire proved devastating. Rivals used Romanos's defeat to overthrow him. Civil wars erupted over succession. The military organisation that had survived for centuries fractured along political lines. Most critically, the defeat at Manzikert broke something psychological. The aura of Byzantine military invincibility, already tarnished, shattered completely. Turkish tribes began pouring into Anatolia, not as organised invasion but as migration. Byzantine provinces couldn't organise effective resistance because the central military structure had collapsed. Within 20 years, the Seljuks controlled most of Anatolia, the heartland that had provided the empire with soldiers and taxes for centuries. The Byzantines would never fully recover those territories. The First Crusade in 1096 provided temporary relief. Western European armies pushed through Anatolia, defeating Seljuk forces and recapturing territory, but the Crusaders established their own states rather than returning land to Byzantine control. The empire survived, even thrived during some periods over the next 3 centuries, but it never regained the power it had possessed before Manzikert. The heavy cavalry that had been the backbone of Byzantine military power diminished steadily. By the 13th century, Byzantine armies relied increasingly on mercenaries, Western European knights, Turkish horse archers, Italian infantrymen, whoever would fight for pay. The cataphract tradition, sustained for over 1,000 years by this point, was dying. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, a parallel evolution was occurring. The collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the 9th and 10th centuries had fragmented political authority across the continent. Viking, Magyar and Saracen raids devastated regions unable to organise effective defence. In this chaos, local strongmen who could provide protection gained power. These were typically men who could afford horses, armour and weapons, who could train in mounted combat. The feudal system that emerged codified this arrangement. Lords granted land to vassals in exchange for military service. That military service meant showing up for campaign with appropriate equipment, which meant armour, warhorse, and weapons for mounted combat. Over generations, this created a hereditary warrior class, the knights, whose social identity and economic power derived from their military function. Early medieval knights were lighter than later centuries would produce. Mail armour, conical helmets, kite shields, and lances. They operated more as mobile shock troops than as the slow, heavily armoured cavalry of popular imagination. But as the medieval warm period brought agricultural expansion and economic growth, as metalworking techniques improved, as political structures stabilised, knightly equipment became progressively heavier. By the 13th century, mail was supplemented with plate armour on vulnerable areas like knees, elbows and chest. By the 14th century, full plate armour was becoming standard for wealthy knights. This progression mirrored the earlier evolution of cataphracts, though the knights developed independently without direct connection to the ancient heavy cavalry traditions. The parallels are striking. Both cataphracts and knights represented warrior aristocracies whose military function justified their social privilege. Both required enormous investment in equipment and training. Both relied on mounted shock combat as their primary tactic. Both became culturally embedded in their societies, to the point where the warrior class's identity became inseparable from their military methods. And both faced the same fundamental challenge: how to remain relevant as infantry developed weapons and tactics that could defeat cavalry charges. The difference was timing. Cataphracts faced this challenge when projectile technology was still relatively primitive. Horse archers with composite bows could harass them, but lack the penetrative power to reliably kill through their armour at range. Infantry with spears and swords could receive charges, but needed perfect discipline and favourable terrain. The cataphracts' heavy armour and mobility gave them a survivability advantage that kept them relevant for centuries despite tactical counters. Knights faced the challenge after projectile technology had advanced significantly. The composite bow had been refined over thousands of years by steppe peoples. The English longbow, developed from Welsh traditions, could achieve draw weights, comparable to all but the most powerful crossbows while maintaining much higher rates of fire. And crossbows, as we've discussed, gave ordinary soldiers the ability to punch through armour with minimal training. The knight's window of dominance was correspondingly shorter. From the emergence of recognisable knighthood in the 10th and 11th centuries to its obsolescence in the 16th century, represents roughly 500 years. Cataphracts remained militarily significant for over a millennium, but during their period of dominance, knights achieved remarkable battlefield success. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 succeeded largely through mounted shock combat. The Crusades, whatever their moral character, demonstrated the effectiveness of Western heavy cavalry against Middle Eastern forces. European expansion into the Baltic, into Iberia, into Eastern Europe succeeded partly through knights' tactical advantages. As with cataphracts, the combination of armour, mobility, and trained warriors fighting in coordinated charges proved devastatingly effective against forces unprepared for them. But also like cataphracts, knights discovered that victory wasn't guaranteed. Infantry using proper tactics could negate cavalry advantages. At Courtrai in 1302, Flemish urban militias destroyed French chivalry through combination of pikes and favourable terrain. At Bannockburn in 1314, Scottish infantry defeated English cavalry through careful position selection and disciplined pike work. At Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, English longbowmen demonstrated that massed archery could destroy mounted knights before they closed to contact. The Battle of Crécy deserves particular attention as it demonstrates many principles relevant to our discussion. In August 1346, Edward III of England positioned his army on a hill near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu in northern France. He had approximately 12,000 men, mostly longbowmen with supporting men-at-arms fighting on foot. Philip VI of France commanded perhaps 30,000 men, including thousands of armoured knights and 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen. On paper, the French held overwhelming advantage. In practice, English tactical positioning and weapon superiority won decisively. The battle began with the Genoese crossbowmen advancing uphill toward the English position. They had marched all day and were tired. Their pavises, the large shields they normally used for protection while reloading, had been left with the baggage train for faster movement. Rain earlier in the day had affected their bowstrings. The English longbowmen, who had kept their strings dry, began shooting. The range was long initially, but as the Genoese climbed the hill, they entered effective range. What followed was a masterclass in the longbow's superiority over the crossbow in open battle. The English archers could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute. The Genoese, climbing uphill, tired, without pavises, could manage perhaps 2 bolts per minute. The math was brutal. For every bolt the Genoese shot, 50 or 60 English arrows answered. The Genoese formations dissolved under this storm of projectiles. They retreated, stumbling back down the hill directly into the advancing French cavalry. The French knights, seeing the crossbowmen retreating and contemptuous of infantry anyway, rode through and over them. Contemporary chronicles claim the French knights deliberately trampled the Genoese for their cowardice. Whether this is true or exaggeration, the result was chaos. The French cavalry charged uphill in disorder, their formations broken, their approach slowed by the terrain and the bodies of fallen Genoese crossbowmen. The English archers, positioned on the flanks of the battlefield, shot into the French cavalry, from both sides as they advanced. Arrows struck horses, causing them to fall and throw their riders. Arrows found gaps in armour where plates joined. Knights who reached the English line were too few and too disorganised to break through the men-at-arms fighting on foot. The French made repeated charges throughout the afternoon and into the evening. Each charge met the same result. Archery disrupted the formation during the approach. The few who reached the English line couldn't break through. Eventually the attack collapsed. French casualties exceeded 1,500 knights killed, including the King of Bohemia, numerous counts and lords, and uncounted infantry. English casualties were perhaps 100 men. The disparity is staggering and speaks to the devastating effectiveness of massed projectile weapons used from prepared positions against mounted cavalry. But notice what Crissy demonstrates. It wasn't crossbows that defeated the French knights, it was longbows. This complicates our narrative about crossbows rendering heavy cavalry obsolete. The reality is that multiple projectile weapons contributed to the decline of armoured cavalry. Crossbows were one factor, longbows another, and later firearms the final blow. Each weapon had advantages and disadvantages. Crossbows required less training and could penetrate armour reliably at closer ranges. Longbows required years of practice but offered much higher rates of fire and comparable penetration from powerful warbows. Composite bows offered good performance with moderate training requirements. Early firearms offered psychological impact and ultimate penetrative potential, despite terrible accuracy and rate of fire. The common factor wasn't the specific weapon. It was the ability of infantry armed with projectile weapons to kill cavalry at range. This capability, once infantry possessed it reliably, changed battlefield dynamics fundamentally. Cavalry could no longer assume they would survive the approach to contact. This meant cavalry had to be more selective about when and where to charge. It meant they needed supporting troops to suppress enemy archers. It meant they became one component of combined arms forces rather than the dominant arm. The process took centuries because cavalry adapted. Knights learned to use terrain for cover during approaches. They developed better armour that could resist some arrows and bolts. They used infantry and their own archers to suppress enemy projectile troops before charging. Heavy cavalry remained effective into the 16th century by adapting to the new reality. But adaptation has limits. The fundamental equation of heavy cavalry, massive investment in equipment and training, produces devastating shock combat capability, only works when that shock combat capability can be delivered. As projectile weapons improved, as infantry tactics evolved, the circumstances where heavy cavalry could effectively charge became increasingly rare. The cost remained, constant or increased. Plate armour became more sophisticated and expensive. Breeding and training warhorses capable of carrying armoured riders required significant resources. Training knights from childhood remained time-intensive, but the effectiveness decreased as counters became more common. Eventually, the cost-benefit analysis no longer favoured heavy cavalry. The transition to firearms accelerated this process. Early 16th century arquebuses were clumsy, inaccurate, and slow to reload. A crossbow was a superior weapon by almost any measure. But firearms had development potential that crossbows lacked. Gunpowder could be made more powerful. Barrels could be strengthened to contain higher pressures. Ignition systems could be made more reliable. By the mid-16th century, arquebuses matched crossbows in practical effectiveness. By the early 17th century, muskets exceeded crossbows in both range and penetrative power. Rate of fire remained terrible. A well-trained musketeer might fire 3 shots per minute, still slower than a crossbowman, but the penetrative power compensated. A musket ball could punch through any armour of its era at combat ranges. This rendered plate armour increasingly pointless. If armour couldn't protect against the primary battlefield threats, why wear it? cavalry adapted by becoming lighter. The cuirassier, wearing only a breastplate and helmet, replaced the fully armoured knight. Later cavalry dispensed with even that, becoming primarily mobile firepower platforms armed with carbines and pistols rather than shock troops armed with lances. Heavy cavalry didn't disappear immediately. Cuirassiers saw service through the Napoleonic Wars, and cavalry charges remained viable tactics in certain circumstances into the 20th century. But the age of the armoured horseman as battlefield king was over. By 1700, no army fielded cavalry expecting them to charge home against prepared infantry. Cavalry scouted, screened, pursued broken enemies, and exploited breakthroughs, but they didn't smash infantry formations through shock impact the way cataphracts and knights once had. This transformation reveals something profound about military technology. The relationship between offence and defence, between protection and penetration, isn't stable. It shifts as technology evolves. For the cataphract's entire period of dominance, armour technology outpaced projectile technology. A cataphract's scale armour could resist the arrows and javelins of his era, reliably enough that the protection justified the weight and cost. When projectile technology caught up, when composite bows and eventually crossbows could penetrate that armour consistently, the balance shifted. Knights experienced the same progression compressed into a shorter time frame. Early knights' mail armour provided adequate protection against the weapons of the 11th and 12th centuries. As crossbows proliferated and longbows appeared, mail became insufficient, driving the development of plate armour. Plate armour provided excellent protection through the 14th and 15th centuries. Then firearms emerged and made armour obsolete in a matter of decades. The modern military faces similar dynamics. Tank armour protects against small arms and shell fragments, but is vulnerable to specialised anti-tank weapons. Body armour protects infantry against pistol rounds and shrapnel, but not rifle bullets at close range. Aircraft survivability depends on not being hit rather than on armour protection. The fundamental problem persists. Protection sufficient to stop modern weapons becomes too heavy to be practical. This forces military planners into the same calculations that ancient and medieval commanders faced. Do you invest in protection, accepting weight and cost penalties? Do you invest in mobility, accepting vulnerability? Do you invest in firepower, accepting that you're not protecting your troops? There's no perfect answer. The optimal balance shifts with technology, with tactics, with strategic circumstances. What made the cataphract and later the knight possible was a temporary equilibrium where protection was practical and effective. Armour heavy enough to stop contemporary weapons was just light enough for a horse to carry into battle. Training and equipment costs were just affordable enough for states and individuals to maintain heavy cavalry forces. Tactical circumstances allowed close combat to occur regularly enough that investment in shock cavalry made sense. When any of these factors changed, when projectile weapons became more powerful, when cost became prohibitive, when tactics evolved to prevent close combat, the equilibrium broke. Heavy cavalry became a poor investment. Armies that continued fielding them suffered defeats at the hands of forces using newer methods. The crossbow's role in this process was significant but not unique. It was one of several projectile weapons that shifted the balance away from armour and toward offensive firepower. Its particular contribution was democratizing that firepower, making it accessible to forces that couldn't afford or couldn't train enough longbowmen or horse archers. A city militia armed with crossbows could defend against armoured cavalry. A peasant conscript could be taught to use a crossbow in time to be useful in a campaign. This accessibility made crossbows militarily important beyond their raw performance characteristics. Even though longbows were arguably superior weapons in skilled hands, crossbows armed far more soldiers across medieval Europe. This pattern, simpler weapons that require less training eventually displacing more sophisticated weapons that require more training, appears repeatedly in military history. Firearms displaced both crossbows and longbows not because early firearms were better weapons, but because they were easier to use. Rifled muskets displaced smoothbore muskets because the improved accuracy justified the slightly increased training requirements. Bolt-action rifles displaced earlier rifles through better balance of performance and usability. Automatic weapons displaced bolt-action rifles by making individual marksmanship less critical. Each transition involved trade-offs, with simpler operation and lower training requirements generally winning over higher performance that required more skill. The cataphract represented the opposite extreme. maximum performance through maximum investment, the finest armour that metalworking could produce, the strongest horses that selective breeding could create, warriors trained from childhood in mounted combat. This approach worked brilliantly when the tactical environment favoured close combat, and when no cheaper alternative could match their effectiveness. Once cheaper alternatives emerged, infantry with pikes and projectile weapons who could be trained in months rather than years, the cataphracts' cost became prohibitive relative to their remaining advantages. Military history offers no permanent solutions because the problems keep changing. The weapons that win today's battles lose tomorrow's. The tactics that prove decisive in one war fail in the next. The training that produces effective soldiers for one type of warfare becomes irrelevant when warfare changes. This isn't just about technology. Though technology is often the most visible driver of change, it's about the constant interaction between offense and defense, between concentration and distribution of force, between quality and quantity, between complexity and simplicity. These tensions create a dynamic system that never reaches stable equilibrium. Any advantage proves temporary because opponents adapt, because circumstances change, because new technologies emerge. The cataphract and the crossbow illustrate this dynamic across more than 1,000 years of military history. The cataphract emerged when cavalry technology advanced beyond infantry's ability to counter it effectively. They dominated for centuries because that advantage persisted. They declined when tactical, economic and technological changes eroded their advantages. The crossbow emerged when urban societies needed weapons that could be mass-produced and quickly learned. It became militarily decisive when the tactical environment made projectile weapons more valuable than shock combat. It declined when firearms offered similar benefits, with greater potential for improvement. Neither weapon's story ended with dramatic finality. Cataphracts didn't disappear after a single decisive battle, where crossbows slaughtered them. Heavy cavalry gradually became less common, less effective, less worth the investment over centuries. Crossbows didn't vanish the moment firearms appeared. They remained in use for hunting and specialized military applications for centuries after muskets became standard. The transitions were messy, gradual, context-dependent. Some armies abandoned heavy cavalry while others continued fielding them successfully. Some regions adopted firearms quickly, while others preferred crossbows for generations longer. Military change happens unevenly because different armies face different circumstances, have different resources, operate in different tactical environments. What we can say with confidence is that by 1700, neither cataphracts nor crossbows remained militarily significant in the way they had been at their peaks. The cataphract's vision of warfare, armoured horsemen delivering devastating charges that shattered enemy formations, had been superseded. The crossbow's vision, mechanical projectile weapons giving common soldiers the power to kill elite warriors, had been fulfilled but by its successor technology, firearms. The specific implementations passed into history, but the concepts they represented persisted and persist still.